The warriors were not happy with Black Kettle because he did not want to stand and fight. He was more worried about saving the people. He was kind of, I don't want to say disowned, but they made sure that he was away from most of the people. His encampment was mostly the old, the people that were handicapped, mostly women and children and orphans.
In the aftermath of Sand Creek, Governor Evans lost his governorship, or resigned from his governorship of Colorado because of the Sand Creek Massacre and the fallout. He remained in Colorado, of course, as a leading citizen and leading politician. John Evans never said, "I'm sorry" for Sand Creek, or that Sand Creek was a mistake, or that Sand Creek shouldn't have happened. He sidestepped the issue as much as he could. John Shivington never apologized for Sand Creek. In fact, in one of his last public appearances, part of his speech was, "I stand by Sand Creek."
Shivington had resigned, and so he could not be punished by military law. He was still a hero in Colorado. Not in the East, but in Colorado, Shivington was worshipped. Well, not long after Silas Soule gave his testimony, he was in Denver. He was the provost marshal. He had just gotten married, and at night he was coming out of a theater, and he heard some shots. And he ran to investigate and then was shot down by 2 assassins. And it was instantly recognized that he was killed because of his testimony.
Why did they have to go kill that Silas in a cowardly way? I felt really proud of him. I was really glad there was somebody in there that had a heart, that he wouldn't allow them to shoot us.
Shivington had claimed to solve the Indian problem, but instead the war really came in retaliation for Sand Creek. And again, Denver was shut off from all outside supplies, again faced famine. Over 200 white people were killed. 8,000 soldiers had to be diverted from the Civil War, and millions of dollars the cost of this was.
The killing had stopped. Killing had stopped in the late 1800s, the active killing of Native American people. But in a way that the genocide has continued. Genocide of our customs, genocide of our languages. I think we're still recovering from that. And once we do recover from that, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, we're going to be very strong people. But I think the trauma that was experienced then is still with us today.
You know, Sand Creek is not a dead history to the Cheyenne people, Cheyenne Arapaho people. In a way, as we take it, as tribal people, the blood is still on the ground.
It's very touching to me when I go to Sand Creek, because you can just stand there and look out in the creek bed and just imagine in your own mind what happened on that day.
You know, if you're Cheyenne and you're Arapaho, you need to go to this place and you need to do some healing, because I feel like people don't realize that we carry this. We carry that tragedy within us.
The Sand Creek Massacre Spiritual Healing Run is an event organized and coordinated by tribal members. We start from the massacre site and run on the trail, of which would have been the military trail back to Denver, and the trail of which our ancestors' body parts were taken on.
Being there and honoring them every year annually with the healing run has definitely brought some great healing to my life. And I feel like that is something that needs to happen with all of the descendants. In 2014 marks the 150th year anniversary since that morning of the Sand Creek Massacre. And I feel like even though it has already been 150 years later, I feel like it's still really important that we continue to honor and remember our ancestors and continue the education.
What I'm going to try and do is talk about how the process that we're engaged in today, memorializing, remembering collectively, is a historical process, that this is something that's been going on now for 150 years. John Shivington was a relentlessly political figure. He had a strong interest in furthering his career, and so in the immediate aftermath of the massacre, John Shivington understood that he needed to control the spin around what had happened at Sand Creek, and he, I would say, lobbed the first volleys in what would ultimately become protracted fights over the memory of Sand Creek. Shivington sent dispatches explaining to his commander that Shivington's men, had attacked a village that he said had been bristling with warriors. In retrospect, that obviously wasn't true. He went on to insist that the native people in that village had been responsible for those depredations. That he said that his men had recovered the remains of white settlers that had been murdered by the native people in that camp. Later that day, Shivington sent a note to the press in Denver, again trying very, very hard to control how this event would be remembered in its immediate aftermath. So as the bodies of his victims were still cooling nearby, John Shivington already had his eye on posterity. It's an interesting question to consider whether or not Shivington's perspective on Sand Creek simply would have become part of the historical record unchallenged if Silas Sewell and Joe Kramer hadn't written the letters that David Hollis spoke about this morning. But they did. Sewell and Kramer, among others, refused to commit the soldiers under them at Sand Creek to the fight, and in its aftermath understood that John Shivington was going to try and characterize their actions at Sand Creek as cowardice. They were very eager to make sure that the record reflected accurately what had happened at Sand Creek. Letters were crucial because what they did is they prompted officials in Washington to begin a number of different investigations into Sand Creek. John Shivington never testified in person at those investigations, but he did send a long and very detailed account of precisely what he claimed his men had done at Sand Creek and also what he believed his goals had been there. And Shivington articulated in this written testimony twin goals. First of all, to try and pacify the plains. Shivington and Governor John Evans both had been engaged in a long process of trying to convince federal officials that white settlers in Colorado Territory were facing mortal peril because there was a grand confederation, a huge alliance of tribal peoples in the fall of 1864. And so in the aftermath of Sand Creek, when Shivington testified about what had happened there, he continued this story. And again, in that testimony, Shivington pointed back, in this case, to human remains that he said his men had recovered there, suggesting once again that the native peoples at Sand Creek had been guilty of depredations, had been guilty of committing atrocities against white settlers in Colorado Territory. Shivington also, though, in that testimony, suggested that at Sand Creek, he and his men had served as nobly as part of the federal government's effort during the United States Civil War. He suggested that George Bent especially had been acting as a Confederate agent and had been working with the Cheyennes and trying to foment insurrection among the Cheyennes to try and have the Cheyennes join the Confederacy, to join the rebellion against the federal government. Silas Sewell disagreed with this rather vehemently, as did other people. Sewell actually thought that what happened at Sand Creek reflected very badly on the service of Civil War soldiers. He was very upset that somehow what had happened at Sand Creek dishonored the otherwise honorable service of men who had been fighting to preserve the Union, and he believed that it cast doubt on the United States' manifest destiny, as it was described at the time. Sewell's assassination, his murder, call it what you want, was an extraordinarily important moment in terms of the way that we remember Sand Creek, and it was important because of the context in which it happened. It wasn't just a matter that Sewell had testified very recently, it was also that President Lincoln had been assassinated approximately a week earlier. The result of this was that Silas Sewell's memories of Sand Creek, his depiction of what had happened at the massacre, persist. These became extraordinarily important memories. In some instances, they were sort of unassailable. These were the recollections of a man who'd been martyred for speaking truth to power. And so people clung to these memories in many cases. One example of that is a so-called Indian reformer in 1879, a woman named Helen Hunt Jackson, who went on to write a book called Century of Dishonor. Helen Hunt Jackson, in 1879, began writing what we would think of today as op-eds or editorials, letters to editors around the United States. In those letters, she characterized Sand Creek as a massacre. She drew on Silas Sewell's testimony before federal investigators. She talked about a number of the same details, the white flag flying over Black Kettle's lodge, the fact that John Shivington's men had desecrated their fallen victims, had desecrated the bodies of women and of children, including infants. Helen Hunt Jackson's, the way in which she engaged with memories of Sand Creek didn't sit well for a number of different people, including William Byers, who, again, we heard about this morning, had been the editor of the Rocky Mountain News. And Byers began saying that Helen Hunt Jackson, not surprisingly, as he had in 1864 and 1865, he suggested that she was sort of out of place in the West. First of all, that she was an Easterner, and so she couldn't possibly understand the necessity of an event like Sand Creek, couldn't understand how this had been a noble battle. He also used what we would call today sexist language, suggesting that she was a woman. And so she was just entirely, he said, out of place in the rough and tumble West. Now, Helen Hunt Jackson, for those of you who know anything about her, she was no shrinking violet, and she gave as good as she got. And so they entered into what we would look back today and describe as a print war. They went back and forth over a period of weeks, increasingly upping the ante over time. As Helen Hunt Jackson was writing, she had one particular goal in mind. She was known, as I said earlier, as an Indian reformer because she wanted to reform the federal government's policy toward Native peoples. Jackson wanted to see Indian affairs in the hands of the Department of the Interior exclusively. And there were a number of people in the Interior Department at that time who were primed to accept this message for a variety of different reasons, not least because the so-called Great Sioux War had just taken place, including the Little Bighorn. So there were a number of people in the federal government who recognized in the late 1870s that Indian affairs weren't being handled properly. At the same time, though, many Westerners still adhered to John Shivington's depiction of Sand Creek. In 1880, I believe it was, editors at the Gunnison Democrat, which was a newspaper published out of Gunnison, Colorado, called for, the language they used was another Sand Creek, that's a quote. What they were asking for was a war of extermination in the aftermath of the Ute uprising. And so the fights over Sand Creek were continuing. Now, George Bent, who, as David Hollis would tell you, was a keen observer of Western history and also of politics. Bent knew what was happening in Colorado. Bent also understood that as the 19th century neared its close, that the American West stood at the center of discussions about the future of the United States. That historians like Frederick Jackson Turner at the Chicago World's Fair were talking about the closing of the frontier and what that might mean for the United States. Conservationists were talking about the impending extinction of the bison, what that might mean for the indigenous people who relied on those animals for their survival in many instances, that readers were consuming piles and piles of dime novels in these years. In other words, again, in popular culture and in public policy, the American West was very much at the center of conversations about where the United States would head in its future. George Bent was dismayed that Native people seemed to have no voice in these ongoing discussions. And so at the end of the 19th century, he began working with a group of scholars. Ultimately, he struck a partnership with a historian named George Hyde. And he and Hyde produced a number of different documents in which Bent, with the assistance of Hyde, talked about Sand Creek. In 1906, just to give you one example, they published 6 articles in a magazine that at the time called The Frontier. And in those articles, George Bent talked about Sand Creek as having been a massacre. He very explicitly rebutted John Shivington's portrayal of what had happened in November of 1864, again pointing back to the way in which the Cheyenne and Arapaho people at Sand Creek had believed that they had struck a perhaps a fragile but nevertheless a peace with white authorities in Colorado Territory, the way in which John Chivington's men had butchered their victims, and on and on. Once again, though, this sort of a revisionist history of Sand Creek met with some resistance. Coloradans, and especially John Chivington's surviving troops, were not at all happy that George Bent was suggesting that they had engaged in a massacre, that they had massacred women and children and the elderly. Jacob Downing, especially, was very, very upset by these characterizations, particularly upset that a Native American man was calling white men uncivilized. And so Downing followed the lead of Byers and others and wrote letters to local papers in which he called George Bent all manner of names and said that Bent was lying, that John Chivington's characterization of Sand Creek remained as true at the beginning of the 20th century as it had in 1864 and 1865. Downing then worked with a number of other people in Colorado, local heritage organizations, to try and memorialize the service of Coloradans in the United States Civil War. Service that, it's important to understand, for the most part, overwhelmingly was very, very noble. That effort culminated in Denver in 1909 with the unveiling of a memorial on the state capitol steps, a memorial that's still there. That memorial lists the battles and engagements in which Coloradans had fought during the Civil War, and it includes on its base Sand Creek as a battle or an engagement rather than as a massacre. And so it's possible to look at Downing's work, at the work of those other heritage organizations in Colorado at that time, and see that what they really did is they smoothed away the rough edges of Sand Creek, and they cast John Chivington's story of the massacre in bronze. Flashing forward pretty quickly here to the era of World War II and the Cold War, in 1950, the state of Colorado and Kiowa County unveiled two memorials. The first of those memorials said Sand Creek Battleground. That memorial is still there today. It's on the so-called Monument Overlook. It overlooks the killing field at Sand Creek. Again, this was Sand Creek Battleground. It was a way of trying to make sure that John Chivington's perspective on Sand Creek would remain vibrant into the future. But at the same time, in that same year, in fact, unveiled on the same day, the Colorado Historical Society put up another monument, and that one said Sand Creek Battle or Massacre, which was obviously equivocal language, suggesting that the way in which people recalled Sand Creek had begun to change over time. Context matters in this case, and from my perspective, what had happened is that by 1950, which was the year in which that memorial was unveiled, the federal government, for about a decade and a half, had been rather aggressively engaged in its own memorialization efforts, looking back to the United States Civil War as an emblem of the United States' longstanding commitment to freedom and liberty. The federal government had used memories of the Civil War, which up until the 1930s were very much contested, had tried to use memories of the Civil War as a way to drum up support for internationalism, for the United States' involvement first in World War II and then in the Cold War. And so in 1950, it made sense for Coloradans to begin to divorce memories of Sand Creek from memories of the Civil War, and also to begin to think about this tragedy in a more ambiguous light. That ambiguity shifted over time. By the late 1960s, the United States, again, pointing to something that Senator Campbell mentioned a moment ago, had again confronted the capacity of American soldiers occasionally to murder innocent civilians, as in the case of the My Lai massacre. By the late 1960s, the so-called modern civil rights movement was also underway. And so people around the United States were becoming more and more familiar with critiques of racial injustice in this country. And at the same time, it was the beginning of the New Age. And so many whites had become fascinated with traditional indigenous ways of understanding the past and indigenous cultures.